By the early 1940s, the skies over Europe already belonged to the crosses of the Luftwaffe. The Blitzkrieg, a lightning war, became the calling card of the Nazi war machine, where aviation played a key role. Hermann Göring, once an ace of the First World War and now Reichsmarshal and Hitler's closest associate, created air forces that struck terror into opponents. Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, all of them fell before the might of German wings. Even proud Albion, Great Britain, was forced to retreat in the air battle. Against the backdrop of these triumphs, Soviet aviation seemed outdated and ineffective to the Germans. In Berlin's offices, intelligence reports about the Soviet air fleet provoked only condescending smiles. Outdated I-16s, clumsy bombers, inexperienced pilots. That's how the Luftwaffe viewed their Eastern opponents. Göring confidently assured Hitler that the Soviet Air Force would be destroyed in 2 or 3 weeks. However, behind the grand facade of Soviet military weakness, processes were hidden that the Germans did not suspect. Hermann Göring was at the origins of the revival of German military aviation. A former World War I ace, awarded the highest order pour le mérite, he became one of the key figures of the Third Reich. Corpulent, adorned with orders and medals, Göring created around himself the image of an infallible leader of air warfare. His self-confidence bordered on arrogance, but it had a real basis. By the summer of '41, the Luftwaffe seemed invincible. The Polish campaign of '39 was the first demonstration of the power of German aviation. Obsolete Polish planes were destroyed right on the airfields in the first hours of the war. Then it was Western Europe's turn. Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, and finally, France. Everywhere the Luftwaffe demonstrated superiority. Even in the Battle of Britain, despite the eventual defeat, German pilots showed the highest class. By the time of the attack on the Soviet Union, Göring had thousands of modern combat vehicles. The backbone of fighter aviation was formed by the famous quote, one of the 109th model, maneuverable, high-speed, with powerful armament. Bomber aviation relied on the 87th and 88th models, as well as the 111th modification. For direct support of ground troops, quote, 4 dive bombers were used. The famous quote 5, striking terror with the wail of their sirens during a dive. German pilots had extensive combat experience. Many of them had been through Spain, where, as part of the 6th Legion, they practiced the tactics of the future World War. Almost all participated in the campaigns of '39 to '41. Among the Luftwaffe aces were true legends. Werner Mulders, who developed the famous quote 7 tick. Adolf Galland, who later headed the Reich's fighter aviation. An important advantage of the Germans was also the tactics of air application. The Luftwaffe operated in close cooperation with ground forces, ensuring the classic Blitzkrieg. The first blow was always delivered to enemy airfields to gain air superiority. Then aviation switched to supporting tank wedges breaking through enemy defenses. Before the attack on the USSR, Göring declared, "My pilots will destroy Bolshevik aviation just as they destroyed Polish and French." German intelligence reported thousands of obsolete Soviet aircraft concentrated at border airfields, ideal targets for the first strike. Göring rubbed his hands, anticipating a new triumph. However, fate had an unpleasant surprise in store for the Reichsmarschall. While Hermann Göring reveled in the successes of the Luftwaffe, changes were taking place in the Soviet Union that went unnoticed by German intelligence. The Finnish War of 1939 to 1940 became a sobering shower for the Soviet command. Outdated 116 and 115 fighters struggled against Finnish Fokkers. SB and DB-3 bombers suffered unjustifiably high losses. This unfamous war, as it would later be called, exposed serious problems in the organization and armament of the Soviet Air Force. Stalin, closely monitoring developments in Europe, understood that the country's aerial shield needed urgent strengthening. In January 1940, General Pavel Rychagov, a 32-year-old combat pilot who had served in Spain and Khalkhin Gol, was appointed commander of the Air Force. Under his leadership, a quiet revolution began in Soviet aviation. The first step was the reorganization of the Air Force structure. Instead of fragmented aviation brigades and regiments, large formations, aviation divisions capable of solving strategic tasks, were created. Simultaneously, intensive work was underway to create new types of aircraft. In the design bureaus of Yakovlev, Mikoyan, and Gudovich, Lavochkin, Gorbunov, and Gudkov, and Ilyushin, engineers worked day and night. Machines that were destined to become legends were born. The Yak-1, MiG-3, Lag-3 fighters, and the Il-2 attack aircraft. Unlike older Soviet aircraft, the new machines were not inferior to German ones in terms of speed, armament, and armor protection. Special attention was paid to pilot training. Combat experience gained in Spain, China, Khalkhin Gol, and Finland was systematized and implemented into flight school programs. The best Soviet aces, such as Anatoly Serov, Grigory Kravchenko, and Pavel Rychagov, developed new tactical techniques for aerial combat. At the same time, Soviet intelligence was also at work. Military attachés in European countries gathered information about German aviation technology. The intelligence network obtained blueprints and technical descriptions. The USSR meticulously studied the Luftwaffe's tactics used in Poland and France. Captured German aircraft were of particular value. When a brand new Messerschmitt 109 made an emergency landing in the USSR in 1940, Soviet engineers had the opportunity to study the enemy's machine in detail. This allowed them to identify both the strengths of the German fighter and its vulnerabilities. An important element of preparation for a possible war was the dispersal of aviation factories. New production facilities were built beyond the Urals, in Siberia and Central Asia, far from the Western borders. This foresight would later save the Soviet aircraft industry. By June 1941, the transformation of the Soviet Air Force was far from complete. New aircraft were only just beginning to enter operational units. Many airfields were not yet properly equipped. Pilots were mastering modern technology, but the main thing was that the renewal process was underway, and it was moving in the right direction. Behind the facade of Soviet aviation's backwardness lay one of the most massive disinformation operations in the history of military art. The Soviet leadership understood perfectly. To gain an advantage in a future war, it was necessary to conceal the true potential of its air forces. The operation to mislead German intelligence was coordinated at the highest level and involved several lines of work. The first element of the disinformation strategy was the creation of a false image of technical backwardness. At parades and air shows accessible to foreign observers, predominantly outdated aircraft models were displayed. The newest fighters, the Yak-1, MiG-3, and Lag-3, were carefully hidden from prying eyes. Their tests were conducted at secret proving grounds far from the Western borders. When German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop arrived in Moscow in the 40th year, he was specifically shown aviation units armed with outdated I-16s. The second direction was the creation of a network of false airfields. Along the western border of the USSR, dozens of dummy air bases with wooden mock-ups of aircraft were built. real combat vehicles were often camouflaged or dispersed to auxiliary sites. German aerial reconnaissance recorded these false targets, and they ended up in the plans for the Luftwaffe's first strike. Later, on June 22nd, 41st year, German bombers would spend a significant portion of their ordnance destroying plywood aircraft. A special role in the disinformation operation was played by the NKVD. Under the leadership of Lavrenti Beria, a leak of false information about the state of Soviet aviation was organized. Through diplomatic channels, front agents, and recruited informants, data flowed to European capitals about the low combat readiness of the Red Army Air Force, problems with fuel and spare parts, and the poor training of flight personnel. At the same time, Soviet counterintelligence hunted German spies near aviation facilities. Caught agents were often allowed to see exactly what corresponded to the created image of backwardness. In some cases, turned agents supplied disinformation to Berlin for years, which formed a false impression of the Soviet Air Force in the German command. An important element of camouflage was also work with the aviation industry. Factories producing the newest aircraft were located predominantly far from the borders and were carefully camouflaged. Documentation for new models had the highest level of secrecy. Test flights were conducted in strictly guarded zones. Even within the country, information about the real characteristics of new equipment was known to a very limited circle of people. Disinformation also affected the training of flight personnel. Pilot training on new types of aircraft was conducted at closed airfields. In border areas, outdated machines were often demonstratively flown, creating the impression of a low level of training of Soviet pilots among potential adversaries. This multi-layered operation bore fruit. By June 41st, German intelligence had a catastrophically distorted view of the Soviet Air Force. A report prepared for Göring indicated that the core of Soviet fighter aviation consisted of outdated I-15s and I-16s, incapable of resisting Messerschmitts. The Germans knew about the existence of new types of aircraft, but significantly underestimated their quantity and combat capabilities. On June 22, 1941, German pilots took to the pre-dawn sky with a feeling of absolute confidence in their superiority. The initial Luftwaffe strikes on Soviet airfields seemed devastating. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed on the ground. In his diary, Colonel General Alfred Jodl recorded, "The Soviet Air Force can be considered routed." Göring triumphantly reported to the Führer about complete air superiority. However, within a few days, the euphoria of the German pilots began to give way to bewilderment. Lieutenant Erich Hartmann, a future Luftwaffe ace, recalled his first engagement with a Soviet fighter. "I was absolutely certain of victory when I spotted a lone I-16. But instead of the expected easy maneuver, the Russian pilot performed an incredible turn and got on my tail. It was only by a miracle that I managed to escape his burst." On the Western Front on June 29th, a battle occurred that forced the German command to re-evaluate their assessments. A flight of Soviet MiG-3 fighters, commanded by Senior Lieutenant Stepan Suprun, attacked a group of Ju-88 bombers escorted by Messerschmitts. In a swift engagement, the Soviet pilots shot down 3 bombers and 2 fighters, without losing a single aircraft. A German pilot, who parachuted to safety, reported to command, "The Russians are flying aircraft that are no less in speed and maneuverability than ours." An even greater shock for the Luftwaffe was the appearance of Il-2 ground attack aircraft, dubbed Black Death by the Germans. On July 3rd, a group of 6 Ils attacked a German tank column near Berezina. The result was stunning: 18 tanks destroyed and 24 trucks. Attempts by Messerschmitts to intercept the Soviet ground attack aircraft met with an unpleasant surprise: powerful armor protecting the machines from below and from the rear hemisphere. On July 7th, near Smolensk, one of the most illustrative air battles of the initial period of the war took place. A formation of 9 Soviet Yak-1 fighters, commanded by Captain Mikhail Korolov, encountered a group of 15 Me-109. Using their altitude advantage, the Soviet pilots attacked the Germans from above. As a result of the swift engagement, 5 German aircraft were shot down with the loss of 2 Soviet ones. The commander of the German group, Oberleutnant Walter Nowotny, reported upon his return to base, "The Russians are using fighters that we knew nothing about. In terms of speed and maneuverability, they are not inferior to ours." An especially unpleasant discovery for the Germans was the tactics of the Soviet pilots. Contrary to expectations, they did not engage in maneuvering dogfights, where the superiority of experienced Luftwaffe pilots was obvious. Instead, Soviet fighters used their advantage in vertical maneuver, attacking from behind the sun and immediately disengaging after the attack. The first weeks of the war brought unexpectedly high losses to the Luftwaffe. By mid-July, German aviation had lost about 800 aircraft, a figure that Göring considered unthinkable before the start of the campaign. On July 21st, at a meeting with Hitler, the Reichsmarschall was forced to admit, "We underestimated the number of modern aircraft the Russians possess and the quality of their pilots' training." In August 1941, the commander of the 4th Air Fleet, Colonel General Alexander Lohr, sent a report to Berlin noting, "Soviet aviation has not been destroyed, as previously assumed. Moreover, the enemy is constantly receiving reinforcements of the newest types of aircraft, which are not inferior to ours." When Hermann Göring reviewed the lists of Soviet aces in the spring of 1943, his face contorted in a grimace of disbelief. How could these subhumans surpass the best pilots of the Reich in skill? The answer lay in the phenomenon of Soviet Knights of the Sky, pilots whose art of aerial combat disproved the myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility. Alexander Pokrishkin, thrice hero of the Soviet Union, became a true nightmare for German pilots. His tactical formula revolutionized the understanding of aerial combat. When a grandiose air battle unfolded over the Kuban in the spring of '43, Pokrishkin shot down 22 German aircraft in 2 weeks. The Germans began to recognize his plane by its tail number and warned each other over the radio. Quote, 3. Pokrishkin's style was characterized by unconventional thinking. He abandoned outdated pre-war dogmas and developed his own tactical techniques. Instead of head-on attacks, he used vertical maneuvers, approaching the enemy from above and out of the sun. Pokrishkin was the first to engage in free hunting, when a pair of fighters independently chose targets for attack without adhering to a strict combat order. Ivan Kozhedub, the most successful Allied fighter pilot in World War II, had a different approach to aerial combat. Methodical, calculating, he preferred to attack at close range, when success was almost guaranteed. He had 62 victories, including 16 Focke-Wulf 190, the most advanced fighters of the Luftwaffe. In February '45, Kozhedub achieved a victory in a battle that became symbolic. In his LA-7, he encountered a jet Me-262, a new generation aircraft. The German pilot, relying on superior speed, made a fatal mistake trying to disengage vertically. Kozhedub, using his superior maneuverability, seized the moment and struck the jet fighter with an accurate burst. Grigory Rechkalov, the second most successful Soviet ace, was distinguished by extraordinary keenness of sight and intuition. He could spot an enemy at extreme range and anticipate their maneuvers. German pilots called him the Russian Falcon for his ability to attack unexpectedly and lightning fast. Once, in a battle over Iași, Rechkalov single-handedly attacked a group of 8 Messerschmitts and shot down 3 aircraft without taking a single hit. Vitaly Popkov, the prototype of the legendary maestro from the film Only Old Men Are Going to Battle, brought an element of artistry to aerial warfare. His famous étagère, a formation of 4 fighters at different altitudes, allowed him to control a large airspace and attack the enemy from different directions. The psychological impact of Soviet aces on the enemy was enormous. By 1943, German pilots began to avoid engagements with known Soviet airmen. Orders appeared in the Luftwaffe prohibiting engagement in single combat with aircraft bearing certain identification marks. German ace Erich Hartmann, who had 352 victories to his credit, later admitted, "Russian aces were worthy opponents. They were distinguished by fearlessness and a willingness to fight to the end." They became especially dangerous by 1943 when they mastered tactics against which we had no effective countermeasures. The phenomenon of Soviet aces refuted the racist theory of the Nazis about the inferiority of Slavic peoples. How could Untermenschen surpass representatives of the master race in aerial combat? This question tormented Göring until the end of the war. The answer was simple: talent, courage, and the ability to learn do not depend on nationality. Soviet pilots proved this in the skies of war, becoming true knights of the sky of the 20th century. When German tank columns were breaking through to Moscow in the autumn of 1941, another battle was unfolding beyond the Urals, a battle for technological superiority in the sky. The evacuation of aviation factories became an operation of unprecedented scale. Thousands of machine tools, blueprints, equipment, and specialists were hastily moved eastward. Factories were dismantled under bombings, loaded onto trains, and sent thousands of kilometers from the front line. In Kuibyshev, Novosibirsk, Omsk, and Tashkent, new production facilities were created from scratch. History has preserved amazing facts. An aviation factory evacuated from Moscow to Novosibirsk began producing its first fighters just 12 days after the arrival of the first echelon. People worked 18 to 20 hours a day, slept right by their machines, but supplied the front with new aircraft. In parallel with the evacuation, the design bureaus were working intensely. Alexander Yakovlev, creator of the Yak series of fighters, recalled, "We worked to the limit, understanding that every day of delay cost the lives of our pilots." Yakovlev's design bureau quickly modernized the basic Yak-1 model, creating the Yak-7 and Yak-9, fighters that surpassed, quote, in key characteristics. Sergei Ilyushin improved his IL-2 attack aircraft, which became a real nightmare for German tank crews. The appearance of the IL-2 modification with a rear gunner's position eliminated the machine's main drawback: vulnerability to attacks from the rear. German pilots nicknamed this modification the flying tank and tried to avoid encounters with it. Semyon Lavochkin, whose Lag-3 fighters initially had a number of shortcomings, carried out a radical modernization. By replacing the heavy wooden structure with a light metal frame and installing a more powerful engine, he created the La-5, one of the best fighters of its time. When the first La-5 appeared at the front in the spring of 1943, German aces were shocked by its speed and maneuverability. In the design bureau of Artem Mikoyan and Mikhail Gurevich, work was underway on the MiG series of fighters. Light, maneuverable, with powerful armament, they were ideal for intercepting German bombers at high altitudes. An important advantage of the Soviet aircraft design school was its ability to adapt quickly. When new modifications of Messerschmitts, Me-109F and G, with improved high-altitude characteristics, appeared at the front in 42, Soviet designers promptly made changes to their machines. Engine power was increased, armament was strengthened, and aerodynamics were improved. Simultaneously with the improvement of existing models, fundamentally new machines were being developed. Jet fighters were created in deep secrecy, the first prototypes of which took to the air even before the end of the war. The confrontation between the design schools of the USSR and Germany was not limited to aircraft alone. There was an intense struggle in the field of aviation armament, radar equipment, and communications. Soviet engineers created aircraft cannons that surpassed their German counterparts in rate of fire and destructive power. New types of ammunition were developed, including armor-piercing and incendiary shells. By mid-43, the technological competition began to tilt in favor of the USSR. The Luftwaffe still had excellent aircraft, but the Soviet aviation industry produced more machines and introduced innovations faster. If, at the beginning of the war, the Germans produced about 2,000 aircraft per month against 1,000 Soviet ones, by 43, the ratio had changed dramatically. The USSR was already producing about 3,000 machines monthly. Stalingrad became a turning point not only in ground operations, but also in the struggle for air superiority. By the autumn of 1942, both sides had concentrated significant air forces near the city. The Luftwaffe was represented by the 4th Air Fleet under the command of Colonel General Wolfram von Richthofen, a talented tactician and experienced commander. Soviet aviation was represented by the 8th and 16th Air Armies, commanded by Generals Timofey Kryukin and Sergei Rudenko. The initial phase of the Battle of Stalingrad in the air favored the Germans. Massive bomber raids turned the city into ruins. On August 23, 1942, the most terrible raid occurred. Over 600 Luftwaffe aircraft unleashed thousands of bombs on Stalingrad. The city blazed, and German pilots reported complete air superiority. However, by September, the situation began to change. Soviet command developed new counter-tactics. Instead of dispersing forces along the entire front, fighters concentrated on key sectors. An echeloned interception system was created. The first echelon met German bombers on the distant approaches to the city. The second echelon attacked breakthrough aircraft. The third echelon directly defended the city itself. An important innovation was the free hunt tactic. The best Soviet aces were tasked with independently selecting targets and attacking them without being tied to a general formation. This allowed for maximum utilization of pilots' individual skill and disrupted the rigid formations of German bomber units. Soviet anti-aircraft artillery also made a significant contribution to the struggle for the skies of Stalingrad. The density of anti-aircraft fire was so high that German pilots called the airspace over the city, quote, "one anti-aircraft guns," not only shot down enemy aircraft, but also forced them to climb to higher altitudes, quote, which reduced bombing accuracy. By October 1942, a turning point occurred in the sky over Stalingrad. Soviet aviation began massive strikes on German airfields. On the night of October 11th, PE-2 bombers struck 3 key Luftwaffe airfields, destroying over 40 aircraft on the ground and damaging runways. At the same time, new Yak-9 and La-5 fighters began to arrive en masse at the front. Surpassing the basic modifications of the Me-109 in performance, Soviet pilots gained a qualitative advantage in technology that they did not have at the beginning of the war. In November, when Operation Uranus to encircle the German grouping began, Soviet aviation achieved complete air superiority for the first time in the war in a key sector of the front. Massive strikes on German airfields, the destruction of transport aircraft supplying the encircled grouping, and continuous patrolling of the airspace made the Luftwaffe's position critical. In Berlin, the reaction to the change in situation was nervous. Hermann Göring, who had recently assured Hitler of the Air Force's ability to supply the encircled grouping by air, was now seeking excuses for failures. At a meeting at the Führer's headquarters on November 24th, he stated, "The Russians are using new tactics against us. They are concentrating huge masses of fighters in narrow sectors and achieving local superiority. Furthermore, they have received new aircraft that are not inferior to ours." Hitler was furious. He accused Göring of incompetence and demanded an immediate restoration of air superiority. The Reichsmarschall promised to transfer additional squadrons to Stalingrad from other sectors of the front and from Germany. But it was already too late. Soviet aviation firmly held the initiative. January 1943 became the culmination of the air battle for Stalingrad. Göring's attempt to organize and, quote, to supply Paulus's encircled army ended in disaster. Of the 5,500 transport aircraft involved in the operation, over 300 were lost. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft gunners turned the sky over the cauldron into a deadly trap for German pilots. Soviet pilots quickly realized that in a direct confrontation with experienced Luftwaffe pilots, their chances of victory were slim. Something fundamentally new was needed to counter the well-oiled German air machine. This led to the birth of unique tactical techniques that became an unpleasant surprise for Göring and his subordinates. One of the most effective innovations was the free hunt system. Unlike the Germans, who adhered to strict formations and clear patterns, Soviet fighters operated in pairs or flights of 4 aircraft, independently choosing targets and attack methods. This tactic bewildered German pilots, who were accustomed to predictable enemy actions. Major Alexander Pokrishkin, who developed and implemented many tactical innovations, recalled, "We realized that we had to fight not by number, but by skill. Every sortie was analyzed, every mistake was dissected. We learned faster than the Germans could adapt to us." Mastery of camouflage became another trump card for the Soviet Air Force. Pilots learned to use the sun, clouds, and terrain as natural cover. Attacks from out of the sun, when German pilots couldn't spot the approaching Soviet fighters, became a classic of air combat. Captain Ivan Kozhedub, the future 3-time hero of the Soviet Union, perfected this tactic, shooting down dozens of enemy aircraft. The use of terrain for surprise attacks also disoriented German pilots. Soviet pilots flew at extremely low altitudes, practically skimming the ground, to suddenly appear before the enemy. German radars and observers couldn't detect aircraft flying at treetop level, which gave Soviet pilots the advantage of surprise. Interception tactics underwent revolutionary changes. Instead of head-on attacks, where German pilots had an advantage due to experience, Soviet fighters began to use vertical maneuvers. Gaining altitude, they would dive on the enemy from above, striking and then climbing vertically, preventing the Germans from organizing a pursuit. Echeloned attacks became another innovation. When German bombers headed for their target, they were met by several floors of Soviet fighters at different altitudes. The first group engaged the escort fighters, the second attacked the bombers directly, and the third finished off damaged aircraft attempting to return to base. Ambush tactics proved particularly effective. Having received intelligence on German aircraft routes, Soviet fighters would take up advantageous positions and suddenly attack the enemy, giving them no time to regroup. This tactic was particularly successful against German transport aircraft supplying encircled groups. By mid-1943, the Soviet Air Force had developed and successfully applied dozens of tactical techniques, many of which were completely unfamiliar to German pilots. Colonel Walter Novotny, one of the leading Luftwaffe aces, wrote in his report to command, "The Russians no longer fly as we taught them. They have invented their own tactics, against which our standard methods are often powerless." All these innovations, combined with the increasing quality of Soviet aviation technology and the skill of the pilots, led to a radical change in the air-loss ratio by the end of 1943. While in 1941 there was one German aircraft for every Soviet aircraft shot down, this ratio was now 5-to-1 in favor of the USSR. The collapse of the myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility became one of the key moments in the history of aerial warfare. By the spring of 1943, the balance of power in the skies had definitively shifted in favor of Soviet aviation. The superiority that Hermann Goering had so proudly boasted remained only in his memoirs. For the last 2 years of the war, the Luftwaffe was in constant defense, attempting to hold back the onslaught of Soviet air armies. What led to such a dramatic turn of events? Analyzing the reasons for the Luftwaffe's collapse on the Eastern Front, several key miscalculations by the German command can be identified. First and foremost, it was a fatal underestimation of the potential of Soviet aircraft manufacturing. Goering and his staff could not believe that the USSR would not only manage to recover the losses of the first months of the war, but also establish the production of aircraft superior to German ones in many characteristics. The evacuation of hurricanes beyond the Urals seemed to the Germans an adventure doomed to failure. When thousands of new fighters and attack aircraft began to roll off the assembly lines of Siberian factories, it came as a real shock to the Luftwaffe. The second serious miscalculation was an overestimation of their own capabilities. Accustomed to easy victories in Europe, German pilots and commanders lost the ability for critical analysis and adaptation. When Soviet pilots began to employ new tactics, the Luftwaffe continued to operate according to old patterns. The rigidity of thought inherent in the Third Reich's war machine prevented it from adapting in a timely manner and finding an adequate response to the challenges. The third factor was the neglect of human resources. The German pilot training system, effective at the beginning of the war, had fallen into disrepair by 1943. A shortage of fuel, experienced instructors, and training time led to young German pilots arriving at the front insufficiently prepared. At the same time, the Soviet training system was constantly improving, providing the front with increasingly qualified personnel. The lessons of the air war on the Eastern Front had a huge impact on the post-war development of aviation. Many tactical techniques developed by Soviet pilots became textbooks for air forces of various countries. The concept of free hunting, echeloned attacks, and the use of terrain for concealment all became standard elements of fighter pilot training worldwide. Technological solutions found during the war determined the directions of aviation development for decades to come. The experience of using armored attack aircraft led to the creation of specialized aircraft for ground troop support. Vertical air combat spurred designers to develop fighters with improved high-altitude characteristics. Even modern combat aircraft carry the genes of machines born in the crucible of that war. But perhaps the main lesson of the confrontation between Soviet aviation and the Luftwaffe is that technological superiority alone does not guarantee victory. The decisive factors turn out to be the ability to adapt, strategic thinking, and morale. Soviet pilots, initially inferior in experience and technology, managed to turn the tide of the air war thanks to these qualities. In post-war memoirs, Hermann Göring confessed, "We lost the war in the air not because we had bad planes or bad pilots. We lost because we underestimated the enemy and overestimated ourselves." These words can be considered an epitaph to the once mighty Luftwaffe, and at the same time an acknowledgement of the merits of Soviet aviators who managed to accomplish what seemed impossible, to turn defeat into victory.